The topic that I chose was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I will do a source comparison with this. So we're going to go over the table of contents, the summary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then we'll go over the summary of the sources. The Cuban Missile Crisis according to ChatGPT, the Cuban Missile Crisis according to Wikipedia, comparing Wiki and ChatGPT, the Cuban-Soviet relations, and then we'll go over the Cuban-Soviet relations and look at it a different way. Then we'll look over the blockade, the conclusion, and then whether students should be able to use ChatGPT. The Columbia Missile Crisis took place in October of 1962. It involved the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Cubans. The main players in the United States was President John F. Kennedy, the National Security Agency, Kennedy's Joint Chief of Staff, and the Organization of the American States. The main character in Cuba was Fidel Castro, and in the Soviet Union it was Nikita Khrushchev. This event took place during the Cold War and is known as the closest we have come to a nuclear war. This event was mainly played out by the White House and the Kremlin, and it really did not involve the normal foreign policy process. So the summary of the sources, there are many sources that can be found regarding the topic, both secondary and primary. One source that is considered a secondary source that I used was written as recently as 2016. However, there are several sources, both old and new, regarding this topic. One great secondary source is the book Born in Fire, A Concise History of Latin America, written by John Charles Chastain. In this source, it gives a description of how the United States spy plane detected the nuclear missiles installation, and then it discusses the actions that the United States took through the President, John F. Kennedy, who requested the Soviet Union withdraw their nuclear weapons or the United States would have to act. Another great source, which can be considered either primary or secondary, is the book 13 Days, a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis, written by Robert F. Kennedy, who was the brother of the President, John F. Kennedy, as well as his Attorney General and advisor. This source is his account of the event. This source allows the reader to view the event through another point of view. I asked ChatGPT to write a paragraph about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In that paragraph, ChatGPT explained that it occurred in October of 1962 and that it was a critical moment in the Cold War. It indicated that when American spy planes learned that the Soviet had covertly installed nuclear weapons in Cuba, roughly 90 miles off the coast of Florida, tensions between the two countries rapidly increased, which is true. Then it claimed that this information led to the 13-day stalemate between the two superpowers and that the threat of nuclear war, intense talks, high-level diplomatic discussions, and a sense of dread as the globe nervously observed the developing events were all characteristics of this crisis. Then it went on to say that a peaceful solution was reached as a result of the diplomatic wrangling and a covert arrangement that saw the Soviet missiles pulled out of Cuba in exchange for the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis serves as a somber reminder of the dangers of nuclear brinkmanship and the significance of diplomacy in preventing global calamity. ChatGPT did seem to have more specific dates, where it included the removal of the missiles in Turkey in July of 1963. The Cuban Missile Crisis according to Wikipedia. I looked at the Wikipedia version of the account and I received a lot of information. It was almost overwhelming. Without being an expert on the topic, I would not know for sure if the information is accurate. However, the information that I have read seems accurate. The Wiki article says that the Cuban Missile Crisis was from October 16th to October 29th, 1962, whereas the AI says it was from October 14th, 1962 to October 29th, 1962. But it didn't officially end until July 1963 when the U.S. removes the missiles from Turkey. The wiki doesn't seem to mention that happening in 1963. Now we will be comparing Wiki and ChatGPT. With the ChatGPT, the length is short and sweet and directly to the point. The timeline says it ended in July of 1963, and the topic was brief. It had a brief summary of the topic. The level of detail, depending on the questions that were asked, depended on how detailed the results were. When asked about the timeline, it was very detailed. It was the same way when asked what the causes were. It laid out 6 causes for the Cuban Missile Crisis and explained those well. The sources and references that it had, it did not have any sources or references. Now with the wiki, the length was extremely long and almost overwhelming and very dense. The timeline says it ended in October of 1962. The topics, there was a lot of topics. The backgrounds, the subheadings, there were several. The level of detail went into full detail regarding each heading and subtopic. And the sources and references, there was over 100 sources and references on the wiki. Wiki states that Fidel Castro had asked the Soviet Union for more aircraft missiles. However, the request was not acted upon by the Soviet. So the wiki states that because of this, Castro began to criticize the Soviets for the lack of revolutionary boldness and began to discussions with China. This seems to try to portray their relationship to be soured. However, that is not the case. This seemed to be an inaccurate because, as the primary source will prove, Castro and Khrushchev have a good relationship. The primary source that I found is the telegram from Fidel Castro to Khrushchev. In this telegraph, Castro is telling how he feels the next 24 to 72 hours are going to go, with 2 options. Either the first option being that the United States is going to send an air attack to take out the installations, or the United States was going to invade Cuba. Castro told Khrushchev that the morale of the Cuban people is exceptionally high and will face the aggression heroically. He continued on talking about in the event the second option occurred, and then they would have the right to claim self-defense when they eliminated the enemy. Toward the end, Castro is showing his gratitude towards Khrushchev and ends the telegraph with brotherly greetings. This source is important when it comes to understanding the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev and proves that the information that the wiki provides is not 100% accurate. Upon what evidence are the narratives of the source based? So looking at both of these, the wiki and the primary source, the wiki, it was based on the Escalante affair, which was another wiki page. And with the primary source, it was a telegraph written between Castro and Khrushchev. So another question was, how are the perspectives of different individuals and groups represented in the sources, and what is their conclusion? Well, in the wiki, it gives the readers the feeling as if Castro and Khrushchev did not like each other, which was wrong. And so in the primary source, Castro ends the telegraph signing with brotherly love. And if they did not like each other, then Castro would have never said with brotherly love. Why did the U.S. choose to respond to Soviet missiles in Cuba with a blockade? According to Wiki, it was either that or an airstrike, and the administration did not want a full-scale invasion, and that McNamara was for the naval blockade. There was only one problem according to Wiki. A blockade was considered an act of war, but the administration did not believe this would provoke the Soviets. So why did the U.S. choose to respond to the Soviet missiles in Cuba with a blockade. According to the primary source, the secret Cuban Missile Crisis documents, the ex-com considered other options from doing nothing to a significant airstrike and an invasion. The source states that the argument was the cost and risk of other alternatives simply exceeded those of the blockade. Okay, upon what evidence are the narratives of the source based? Well, according to the wiki, they used a speech from President John F. Kennedy and the book Essence of Decisions by Graham T. Allison. So, upon what evidence was the narratives of the primary source based? The primary source I chose to compare this topic to is the book The Secret Cuban Missile Crisis Documents, which has documents from the CIA, such as the telegraph messages, maps, memorandums, estimates, and briefing papers. So in this section, the two seem to be in agreement with what happened to cause the blockade. Both sources include that the Kennedy administration thought of going to either a serious route or the airstrike, or a lesser of the two evils with a blockade. I believe that in both the wiki and the ChatGPT, there is some credible information within each one. However, there is also some information that seems to be a bit off, which was my original hypothesis. In the Wikipedia over the Cuban Missile Crisis, the author Graham Allison is mentioned around 13 times as a reference, which is considered to be a credible source. I used a source similar to these, also written by Graham Allison, which is the book The Secret Cuban Missile Crisis Documents. So should these students be able to use ChatGPT? Well, there are pros and there are cons for using ChatGPT. So the pros seem to be that this can help the students gain a better understanding of a topic by being able to ask questions and get answers. They can also use it to explain things in ways that the instructors may not be able to. However, there are many cons to using ChatGPT. Some of the information may not be accurate. And some students may not think for themselves and would rely on the ChatGPT to do their work for them. And some do not cite their sources, therefore the information is considered to be plagiarized. So here are my sources that I used. Here's the first page. So I used The Secret Cuban Missile Crisis Documents by Allison Graham, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency PDF, the book from our class, Chastain's Revolution Born in Blood and Fire, A Concise History of Latin America. I used Castro's 5 Points, White House Tapes, The Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy, The Address to American People about the Cuban Missile Crisis, transcript of the speech delivered at the White House. And here are the rest of the sources that I used for my annotated bibliography. The Kennedy, which was the 13 Days, a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I used a interview of Dan Feen. He was a man that actually worked in the White House during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I used the CIA documents of the Cuban Missile Crisis by Mary McAleese. I also used the telegram from Fidel Castro, and then, of course, the Wikipedia source. Thank you for watching my source comparison.